Okay, so you saw the title of the video and you know what this is about. But before we get into this, I'd like to tell you how and why I got to this point. So this is my studio. This is where I film and narrate the vast majority of my videos. It's actually just a 10 by 10 bedroom or 100 square feet. And for you guys in metric land, that's about 3 by 3 meters or 9 square meters. It's not very big at all. I make it look big because I position the camera at the far end corner of the room, like this. In fact, when I have fans come over, which I used to do all the time before the pandemic, the first thing people would say upon entering the room is, "Wow, it looks so much bigger on YouTube." So I have this one workbench here, and this is the only place I really have in the house to work on projects, whether I'm filming those projects or not. Of course, I like to be working on several projects at once, and so this workbench is sort of the bottleneck. Let me give you an example. If I tear apart a computer in a million pieces and then I realize, hey, I need to order some part or tool online and it takes a week to get here, well, I can't just leave everything on the bench for a week. I've got to go put it back together or put it on a crate or something so I can move it off the bench. Also, if you look at the ceiling and the walls, you'll see some really shoddy work for putting sound deadening up. Keep in mind, I did this many years ago, before I was even known as the 8-bit guy, and it was on a shoestring budget. Originally, I just used this packing foam, which isn't all that great for sound deadening because it isn't thick enough, and it isn't rated for use like this because of the lack of fire retardants. Also, because it was so dark in color, it vastly reduced the ambient light in the room, so I ended up covering it with a sheet. I was trying to do it all nice and fancy like on the ceiling, but it was just taking too long, so I gave up and finished it the cheap way. Also, I installed these LED spotlights in the ceiling, and this greatly improved the lighting situation in the room. I used to use light stands, and if you look at some of my older videos like this one, you can see what the lighting used to look like as compared to now. I also built this railing system above the bench here so I can mount a down-facing camera anywhere I need. This was also made on a shoestring budget and made with cheap metal conduit from the hardware store and some 3D printed parts. I am also still somewhat overrun with old computers and stuff that people sent me. As you can see, I have stuff piled on the floor here all the time because I just don't have anywhere else to store them. These shelves back here used to be for storing the t-shirts that I sold, but as I sold out of the t-shirts, I ended up putting things here on the shelf, and now I have no room for any more shirts. If you think about it, my YouTube channel is a business, and my business just grew way too fast for the space I had to work with, so ultimately I need more space. Now, I thought about building a new building in my backyard. There are some limitations, though. The city of Kennedale will only allow an accessory building to be 10% of your backyard. So obviously I needed to find out how big that was, so I measured and created a fairly accurate representation in SketchUp. And so all I need to do is add the porch and the sidewalk here, as they technically count as backyard space, and see what that adds up to. As you can see, right around 3,200 square feet. So 10% of that is 320 square feet. Of course, that's the footprint of the building foundation, not the interior space, which will be less. So that's not bad. That's at least 3 times bigger than my current studio. Of course, my wife and many other family members had been urging me for years to get a wooden storage shed, something like this. These are certainly affordable, but I couldn't see trying to build a studio in something like that. And also, my wife had been wanting, or perhaps demanding, some sort of outdoor storage to put lawn equipment and stuff like that in so we can move all that junk out of our garage. Which I'm all for, but I was afraid if I bought some small wooden storage building like this, then that would essentially mean I would not be able to build something nicer in the future. At least not without paying somebody to demolish the old one. So a few years ago, I had a contractor come out and quote me on building a small 320 square foot building in my backyard on a concrete foundation, kind of like a small house. And they quoted me a number really close to $100,000. And that number just didn't sit well with me because, first of all, I couldn't afford that much. And second of all, you could almost buy a whole house for that here in Texas. So I just abandoned that idea for a while. Well, my brother runs the Geek Pub, and he's also been looking for more space. So a couple of years ago, we decided to find some sort of building that was maybe 1,000 square feet and go in on it together. We looked at a lot of possible buildings, but we really just ran into one unsolvable problem. You see, I live in the city of Kennedale, just south of the Metroplex, and Mike lives up in Keller on the complete opposite side of the Metroplex. So obviously, we'd want a building that's somewhere in between us. Obviously, I don't want to drive an hour to go to my studio every day, and neither did he. The trouble is, anything that's remotely considered in between us is prime real estate. Basically, anything we found in this area was way too expensive. There were very reasonably priced buildings south of me or north of him, but those just wouldn't work. So after a couple of years, I kind of gave up on that idea as well, and I just decided to call another contractor out here just to see if they give me a different quote. And these guys quoted me $36,000, which seemed a lot more reasonable. So yeah, I told him to go ahead and get started. Of course, next I needed to come up with a design. At first I looked at just a basic square building, but I didn't think this looked very good. But more importantly, my wife still insisted that part of this building be used like a traditional storage shed. And there wasn't a really good way to divide this building up like that. So instead, I came up with an L-shaped design that sort of complements the existing shape of the back of the house. And of course, since the city doesn't count concrete as building footprint, I could put a nice porch here. So this is the final design that I came up with and submitted to the city. There are 3 rooms, and if you combine them together, the total square footage is 280 square feet. This smaller room here has its own door and will serve as the outdoor storage shed my wife wanted. It's 58 square feet, which should be more than enough. The main room here, which will be the new studio, is 114 square feet, which is 14 more than my current studio, and this second room, which will be an additional work area, is 107 square feet. Again, that's 7 more than my existing studio. In fact, the 2 rooms together is 222 square feet. Now, obviously, I could have made this all just one big room, but I sort of like the idea of having 2 distinct areas. So anyway, after submitting to the city, it took nearly 3 months to get the building permit, and then things started to move along pretty quickly. The concrete guys came out and leveled the ground and set the forms in one day, and then the next day they came out and finished digging the beams and laying rebar. Now, I know it looks like a square building, but that's because they decided to pour the porch as part of the same slab. You'll see what I mean later. 3 days later, after the city came and inspected, the concrete truck arrived, and actually it took 2 trucks to finish the whole thing. These guys used a pumping truck to get the concrete pumped from the street to my backyard. And for those that are curious, this is one of those bolts they use around the edges. This is what the frame will mount to. And to finish it off, they used a power trowel, which looks like a giant fan. And just a few hours later that day, here's the finished foundation. And here's the next day after it's mostly done curing. The very next day after that, a big truck of lumber arrives with a forklift attached to the back. Myself being a bit mystified how he plans to get that to the backyard, but quite amazingly, he just manages to lift the lumber up and above the roof of the house and just barely squeezes through the gates to the backyard. A couple of days later, the framers show up, and they hadn't been there more than 30 minutes, and they had already started raising walls. Within just a couple of hours, they'd started to make it look like an actual building. Next comes the Tyvek wrap. Now, one interesting thing about this, it's essentially the same material that most floppy disk sleeves were made of during the 1980s, only this stuff's a bit thicker. And next comes the siding. I had thought about doing brick, but not only was it more expensive, but it would have meant less interior space since the walls would be thicker, and I was limited to 320 square feet for the building footprint. A couple of days later, we have some roofing guys out. One guy is actually cutting my neighbor's tree branches since they're actually in the way. And here goes the tar paper, or roofing felt, whatever term you prefer. And then, of course, the shingles. I will mention that during most of this process, the temperature outside was well over 100 degrees. For you guys in metric countries, that's like 41 degrees Celsius. Now it was my turn to start work on the electrical and network stuff. Now, since I was doing a lot of this after dark, I bought these little clamp-on rechargeable LED lights. I had some old halogen work lights, but those are like space heaters, and being it was hot enough already, being like 95 degrees outside, even at nighttime, I didn't want to use those. And as you can see, they lit up the place pretty well. Now, the first thing I wanted to do was install these wall boxes. These kind here are designed for electrical sockets to go in this side, and network jacks to go on this side. So the funny thing is, when the builder and I first talked about the electrical, he said something like, yeah, I'll put you a light in each room and a plug on a couple of walls. And I was like, no. I need a lot more than that. I want like 4 outlets on every wall, 4 Ethernet jacks on every wall, 4 light fixtures in each room. So I just decided to do the whole thing. However, I was on a bit of a time deadline to get this done, and even though I'm pretty good with electrical work, there was one thing I wasn't quite sure how to do, at least how to do correctly to meet code for the city inspector. And that was, of course, running the electrical line from the house to the building. So I asked the builder to send his electrician out to do that part. I wasn't expecting that Morgan Freeman would be my electrician. Another problem was the breaker panel in the garage. It's full. Nowhere to add a new breaker for the external building. One problem I have is 3 electric car chargers, one outside and then these 2 in the garage. So what I decided to do was remove this one. It's a low power charger that runs at 12 amps anyway, as you can see by the smaller wires on this breaker. I have a sub panel inside the house about 20 feet from this panel I can eventually move that charger to. Anyway, I'm a stickler for labeling things, so here's the new breaker. Anyway, once he got out here, I just decided to let him finish the electrical work and let me handle the network stuff since I have my hands full already. So I ran a total of 16 jacks inside the 2 rooms. As usual, I try to route these somewhat together so the attic isn't just a mess of spaghetti. I also try to make sure the Ethernet was always separated from the electrical, which should reduce interference on them. And as an example, I always run them along opposite studs. And here's a little tour of where we're at so far. By the way, these doors will be flipped around where they open inside the building. Okay, let's switch to the wide angle lens. So we're in the workshop room, and moving into here, this will be the new studio. This corner here will most likely be where the workbench and everything that will be on camera will go. Looking over there, that's the outdoor storage area I mentioned before, but it'll be totally walled off from this room. But over here in this corner, this is where I'll be bringing down all the network cables into the room. And believe it or not, I used an entire box of 500 feet worth of Ethernet cable just for the 2 rooms.
You know, as gruelingly hot as it is out here right now, it's important that I do this work right now because I can't overstate this enough. For every hour I spend out here working on this during the new construction phase will save me probably 10 hours of work trying to do it once the building is finished. And I speak from experience on this, so I've just got to push through and get this done.
But I wasn't quite done yet. I needed to run 2 more Ethernet cables to the outside, and these will be for my security cameras. I'm putting one here and then another one on the corner over here. The electrician had finished running the conduit and wire for power, but I still needed to get a network cable run through the same trench, and my electrician had essentially cut a notch out of this piece of wood so that his metal conduit could run flush up against the brick. I'm using PVC conduit here, so I'm going to do it a bit differently. I'm using 2 of these 45-degree pieces to help me get around the obstacles. Now, hopefully you can see what I mean from this angle. And eventually, I'll have to fish the fiber optic line up through the attic here. Next, I'm going to pick a spot on the side of the new building where the network will go through and start drilling. And there we go, not too hard. And here's the little box I'm going to use. Okay, now I've got all the other pieces measured and cut, and time to start cementing them together. This stuff here is just primer, and then here's the actual cement. Now, I'm only connecting a few pieces at the moment because my plan is to insert a piece of scrap Ethernet cabling before connecting it all together. That way I can use it as a pull string for the fiber optic line later. Next, I needed to attach the conduit to the brick, so I used a masonry bit to drill some holes in the brick. I know some people prefer using the mortar, but in my experience, anything I've ever drilled into mortar lasts about a month and falls out, so I always drill right into the brick. Next, I use canned air to blow the debris out of the hole. Here's the anchor. And finally, time to screw the bracket on. And here's the finished conduit. Before I pull the fiber patch cable between the 2 buildings, I wanted to test it. After all, running a broken cable won't do me any good. So I took the cable and ran it between 2 transceiver units, and then plugged the Ethernet into my laptop. Of course, I'll need to disable Wi-Fi. And yeah, it seems to be working just fine. Time to go pull it through the conduit. Inside the new building, I've hung the bundle of cables up above the ceiling, and this is to make sure that it's out of the way for the drywall installers. Also, you can see I've already run my precious fiber optic cable, without which the rest of these cables would be pointless. And so this concludes part 1 of the new studio build. Now I'll come back with a part 2 after the building is finished and let you see how I do all the wiring and network and everything like that. And just, by the way, I haven't really quite decided what kind of interior design I'm going to use for the studio. Now, I could just move this bench out there. You know, that's fine. I could do that, or I could just come up with something completely different. I'm actually open to ideas. If anybody wants to send me like a 3D render or of something that they think I should make. I mean, you've got basically the dimensions of the room here in the video. So, you know, tell me what you think is a good idea. The other thing I wanted to mention is you may be asking what this game is that I've got here running on my mini pet. Well, I won't spill all the beans on this, but this is a new game I've been working on for the past month or so, and it's actually designed to run on all Commodore computers, including the PET, the Commodore 64, VIC-20, and eventually even the Commander X16. So anyway, I'll be doing a full video on that in a little bit, but I hope this whets your appetite just a little bit. But anyway, if you've made it this far, then Thanks for watching.